Our speaker tonight is Eric Metaxas. There is so much that could be said. This week during Acton University, he presented a lecture on Wilberforce, and tonight will be speaking to us on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Christian social witness. Two authentic, real people who, based on the principles of Scripture and their love of God, made a difference in the communities where they lived, in the nations where they served, and those principles continue to affect how the world thinks today. They lived their faith in ways that, in spite of adversity, were fully flourishing. Eric has not only written about great men, he has spoken to great men. If you haven't, I would encourage you to watch the YouTube clip of Eric's speech at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. He spoke on an authentic Christian witness and a Christian-led life, and he spoke to the leaders of our country. His humor, his insight, and his presentation were disarming and penetrating. The fullness of Eric's wit, wisdom, and thoughts came alive, and he spoke the truth. Now, Eric, I have to say to you, you have written a very big book. It is 591 pages long, a very large book. And as a man of letters, I should also say, Eric, it's available in the bookstore for sale afterwards. I also know that as a man of letters, you're very aware of Lord Acton, of whom the Acton Institute is named. And based on what I heard you say today, you've actually not read the biography of Lord Acton at a mere 548 pages. And I know you're coming back in October for the Acton annual dinner, I would just encourage you. I think this is a great book. You take a lot of long airplane rides, and I think you would like this book. No pressure at all, really. No, I'm just saying there's no pressure. Of course, you're here and you're sitting next to Father Sirico tonight, the founder of the Acton Institute. Father Sirico has, no offense, Father, but a very tiny book at a mere 213 pages. I think this was the abridged version, though, I think. Oh, by the way, did you know that Father Sirico is a part of an Italian family from Brooklyn? And that he has a brother, Tony. And the brother, Tony, played Paulie Walnuts on that HBO series, about the Sopranos, kind of the mafia, Italian, Brooklyn. And so actually, I would encourage you to read this book as well, if you know what I mean. Again, it's your choice, really. They're both waiting here for you. So here we are tonight with a very interesting man. A resident of New York City, a husband, a father, the son of Greek and German immigrants. I'm just going to leave that one there, okay? Just leave that there. Graduate of Yale University, one-time editor of the Yale Record, writer for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Christianity Today. First Things, he wrote books for Veggie Tales and some of their videos. So, how many of you, by raise of hands, are on a first-name basis with Larry the Cucumber and Bob the Tomato? All right. Eric's the founder of Socrates and the City, a monthly series in New York City on life and God. And tonight, here at Acton University, Eric Metaxas is our speaker on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Eric, welcome.
You're dead to me. You're dead. As long as our mother is alive, it's okay. You see, the Dutch don't get that. It's a Godfather reference. What a joy to be here. I always tell my wife that I travel the country. We live in New York, of course, but I travel the country to get encouraged, because what I see happening around the country gives me the encouragement I need to live my life in New York, doing what God has called us to do in New York City. My wife runs a crisis pregnancy center in Manhattan. But when I go around the country and speak at Crisis Pregnancy Center fundraisers, there's about this many people in the room, sometimes more. We don't get that many at our fundraisers, although I sing, as some of my friends will attest, at those fundraisers. I won't sing tonight, don't worry. But there's so much I want to share with you. It really is a joy to be here. Thank you, Father Sirico and Acton Institute. I really will read that biography, I have to say. Nonetheless, Dwight, you're dead to me still. I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I came to write the Bonhoeffer book, and then I want to tell you briefly the story of Bonhoeffer. We'll have some time for Q&A. And let me let you know in advance, I prefer true or false questions. Yes. So, keeps it moving. My story, okay, as Dwight, my dear former friend, just shared with you, my parents are European immigrants. My dad came from Greece, hence my surname Metaxas, and my mom came from Germany, hence my deep love for Siegfried and Roy. And I think I will continue to use that joke as long as people laugh at it. I was raised, if you're raised half Greek and half German, you're basically raised Greek. That's the bottom line, right? If you know any Greeks, you understand that Greeks know that the best thing you could possibly be is Greek. And I was only 50% Greek, but I always tried to be more than 50% Greek. I failed, but DNA will not cooperate. You're just stuck. But I have to say that I was raised in the Greek culture and in the Greek community, in the Greek church, really. Went to the Greek Orthodox Church, was an altar boy, grew up in that family of faith. For me, it was mostly a cultural experience. I didn't really hear the gospel, know the word of God, pray, know how to pray. It was mainly a cultural faith, and many of you I know what that is. You've experienced that. It's quite different from the real thing. So it was a wonderful experience, but far from a complete experience. And then I stumbled off to Yale University, which you may have heard is slightly secular. It's only been secular for like the last 200 years. It used to really be a vibrant dynamo of faith in the 18th century. But it is now whatever the opposite of that is. I think a vortex, faith-killing kind of institution. And that's true, and we know that. You wouldn't be at the Acton Institute if you didn't understand these kinds of things. But I went there, and I always say, if you have to go to Yale or any of those kinds of schools, just don't go with an open mind. That's the key. This is the key. If you go with an open mind, you're going to be in big trouble. So I was an English major. I graduated and was pretty sure that the meaning of life is that there is no such thing as the meaning of life, and you don't ask that question in polite society. I would have not described myself as a nihilist, but I was thoroughly confused. I was certainly sure that Christian faith and that Christian stuff could not be the answer. Maybe it was part of something larger, but the idea of that being the only thing, it was a hopelessly parochial, narrow way of seeing the universe, and I just dismissed it as all educated people must, obviously. And with that attitude, I stumbled off to New York and then Boston, trying to be a writer, and I don't know how you become a writer. I wanted to be a novelist or follow in the footsteps of some of my heroes, John Cheever, John Updike, and really what I did was I floundered, and then I drifted, and then I floundered and drifted simultaneously. And if you do that just right, you end up moving back in with your parents, which is exactly what happened to me, and I don't recommend that. I don't recommend it. Yes. Don't applaud. It's a dark truth. And I moved back in with my parents. I don't recommend moving in with my parents specifically because some of you here have met my parents. You know, European immigrants, working class European immigrants, don't have the attitude that the typical American parents have when their kid is trying to be a writer and floundering and drifting. They don't say, "Oh, Eric's trying to find himself. It's grist for the mill. You know, he'll land on his feet." No, their attitude is, "Eric, listen, why don't you find yourself a job, like right away, and help us pay the rent here?" And I have to say, that's kind of where I come out all these years later. It's called tough love. And so it was a really hard year for me. Didn't know what I was doing. Didn't know that the meaning of life was something that was worth even thinking about. I was quite unhappy. Into that misery, the Lord sent a man, a friend, who was very serious about his faith, and ironically, he was an Episcopalian. Thank you. Thank you. Got to get the cheap shots in when you can. I got a really menial job while I was living with my parents as a proofreader at Union Carbide in Danbury, Connecticut, and the Hebrew word would be Gehenna. Are you familiar with that word? It was unpleasant. I was about a quarter of a mile. It's always nice speaking to a biblically literate crowd. I was a quarter mile from the nearest window. I think that's almost literally true. Fluorescent lights. It was not good. For somebody who wanted to be a poet, a humor writer, and a novelist, proofreading scads of text, it was awful. It was absolutely awful. And in this misery, in this pain, comes this friend who knew a lot about the Bible, and he would talk to me. We'd have these conversations, and I really did think it's safe to talk to him because, he's an Episcopalian, and they certainly don't take this stuff all that seriously, so it's safe to talk. So keep talking. And we would talk, and the weeks passed, and the months passed, and to some extent, my intellectual objections to the faith began to be dealt with. But we all know you cannot reason your way to faith in Jesus Christ any more than we can swim to Hawaii. But you can at least walk as far as California, perhaps, and then, God has to come to you. And so I think that during this period I was walking in California, so to speak, I really was not ready to embark on any serious journey, but I was beginning to be less troubled about it, beginning maybe to see it more clearly. And then one night in the summer of 1988, I had a very dramatic dream where the Lord spoke to me. I don't know if this has ever happened to you. It happened to me. It had very little to do with my free will because I was unconscious. I tend to be unconscious when I dream. I don't know about you, but I would say that's probably preferable. It's kind of like asking Lazarus how much faith Lazarus had, because you need to have faith if you want to be healed, obviously. You need to exercise your faith. So how much faith did Lazarus have? None. He was a corpse. God acted upon him. Similarly, I was a spiritual, theologically true, biblically true, think about it. And I was, as we all are, a spiritual corpse. Not much you can do as a corpse. Almost nothing. And God acted on me. And in this dream, the Lord revealed himself to me. I won't tell you that story. It is, I'm happy to say, it featured in a beautiful video on my website that was made by Redeemer Presbyterian Church, Tim Keller's church in New York City. Extraordinary video where I tell the story of this amazing dream. But the Lord revealed himself to me, and I woke up born again, different, knowing that God is real and everything that goes with it. So my life was changed dramatically. And at that point, I remember that summer, the man who had led me to faith gave me a copy of Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship. Says, "Have you ever heard of Bonhoeffer?" And I remembered that, no, at Yale they don't teach you about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Have I mentioned Yale? That it's secular? I remember him telling me, oh yeah, well, Bonhoeffer was a German pastor and theologian who, because of his faith in Jesus, got involved in the plot against Hitler and was killed in a concentration camp in 1945. And I said, what? Somebody because of his faith in Jesus stood up for the Jews? Somebody because of his faith in Jesus stood against the Nazis? Why have I not heard this story? And then I remembered that I'd attended Yale University. Although, it's not in the popular culture either, right? That's a whole other speech. But we don't live in a culture where you hear these kinds of stories. And I was kind of angry, not just at this, but at so many other things that I would hear and say, why haven't I heard this? Why haven't I heard this? And it just stuck with me, this amazing story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I was further moved by the story of Bonhoeffer because I am, as I said, half German. My mother grew up in Germany during this terrible time. And my grandfather, at age 31, was killed in the war, a genuinely reluctant German soldier. There were more than a few of those. He would listen to the BBC with his ear literally pressed against the radio speaker, because if you were caught listening to the BBC in those days, you could be sent to a concentration camp. So I was always haunted by this image of my grandfather and what my family went through, what my mother went through, losing her father in this terrible, horrible war in 1944. So the story of Bonhoeffer really stuck with me. I said, this is extraordinary. A German who spoke up for people like my grandfather, a German who did the right thing. What an amazing story. And I sort of filed it. When God came into my life, he took over my career. I figured that was a fair thing. And frankly, I ended up writing children's books before VeggieTales. I wrote a lot of children's books. Then I had the privilege of getting to work for my hero, Chuck Colson. I always loved and admired him. I never dreamt I would get to meet him and work for him, but I did on Breakpoint Radio. And after the privilege of that, I ended up working for VeggieTales, as Dwight mentioned earlier. I don't want to pretend that I invented VeggieTales. Sometimes I'm introduced and people think I'm the VeggieTales guy. Far from it. I was just on their staff as a writer. I did have the privilege of being the voice of the narrator on the Esther video. If you watch the Esther video, you care about that? In New York, people haven't even heard of VeggieTales, so I'm thrilled. I'm so thrilled. But I'm the voice of the narrator. I'm a non-pictured vegetable. Obviously, it's a vegetable universe, but you don't know what kind of vegetable the narrator is, because I was off stage, and you don't see me. I believe I was a broccoli rabe, but I'm not sure. We'll never know. So, but I have to say that I was able to do that, and then I wrote some things. I wrote the Hamlet omelet parody and Lala Kindly Viking, and wrote a number of books, which are far shorter than any of these books that have been shown to you by Dwight. But I really did love doing that. And then I wrote a book. I'm telling you this because this is how I came to write the Bonhoeffer book. I wrote a book with the silly title, Everything You Always Want to Know About God, But We're Afraid to Ask, which is a book of apologetics that sort of mixes some humor with serious apologetics, because I always wanted to explain my faith to my friends who are thoroughly secular, meaning that they're not going to ask you about, can you reconcile this genealogy with, they don't know anything. They're biblically illiterate. And so you have to talk from the beginning about, do you really believe, what do you think about heaven? What does the Bible say about this or that? Just the basics. So I wrote this book with the title, Everything You Always Want to Know About God, But We're Afraid to Ask, and found myself amazingly on CNN talking about this book. Now, if you watch CNN, you may notice that they don't have so many Christian apologists on, ever. And I was on there, and I was expecting, one of these really tough questions, like how can a good God allow suffering? Instead, I get this softball of a question. The anchor says to me, what's this in here about Wilberforce? And in this whole book, I just had a paragraph about William Wilberforce, where I mentioned that he took the Bible so seriously that he ended up changing the world. And that's about as much as I knew. I knew the basics of the story of Wilberforce, but this led to a publisher saying, oh, by the way, there's a movie coming out called Amazing Grace celebrating the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade. Would you like to write a biography of Wilberforce to come out with that movie? And I thought, well, that's interesting. I never thought about writing a biography. I would say I really never met a genre I didn't like, but I didn't really like biography or really think that I ever would write a biography. I say that I'm far too self-centered to want to spend 2 or 3 years thinking about someone else in depth like that. But when I was asked this, I was flattered to be asked, and I thought about it, and I thought I can maybe exercise some of my literary muscles in writing about this figure in this wonderful period in history, and I prayed about it, and frankly, the Lord spoke to me about this. I won't tell you how, and there's no video on my website, ericmetaxas.com, explaining how the Lord spoke to me, but he did. And so I decided to write it. So I wrote that book, and I'd go around the country talking about Wilberforce, and inevitably someone would ask, who will you write about next? Who will you write about next? Some people would say, about whom will you next write? And that's, as a Yale English major, I find myself being sort of an evangelist for the word whom. I recommend it to you. You can, actually now there's an app, you can download it for free, so you don't even have to pay anymore. In my day, you had to pay. Yeah, that's the beauty of the net. So I was asked this question over and over, and it struck me that if I were to write another biography, and I really had no ambition to write the first one, much less the second one, but I thought perhaps the Lord would call me to write a second biography, and it would certainly have to be about the very great Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And so, of course, I assented ignorantly, having no idea what I was getting myself into. It was a very difficult process writing the book. He is an extraordinary figure. He contains multitudes, so to speak. He is somebody who was not merely a man of action or a man of public life like Wilberforce, but he was a man of considerable theological depth, and pulling all those things together was difficult. Getting the book published was difficult. The first publisher insisted that I cut the book dramatically, and I didn't feel free to do that. It was very difficult. I thought there's a time, to cut out the purple prose, and there's another time where you say, no, this must be what it is. And so it was difficult. I had to switch publishers. I would never say the name of the terrible first publisher, but their initials are Harper San Francisco. I wouldn't keep that in this room, please. So, but it was very painful, to be quite honest, very, very painful. But in the midst of this is one of these cases in 20-something years, the Lord's spoken to me a number of times, and the Lord spoke to me again, rather dramatically, making it clear to me that somehow this was his book. He had his hand on this book. And it was painful enough for me that I really needed some kind of palpable encouragement. This was very palpable. I wouldn't say word from the Lord, but communication from the Lord. And again, if your theology precludes that, I doubt your salvation. So, I'm just saying. But yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Calvin said it's okay. So, So I basically struggled writing it, struggled getting it published. It was quite a painful experience, but I felt very strongly God had his hand on this for his purposes. Well, little did I dream, honestly, that the book would succeed as it has done. I am not used to, and I say this bluntly, I'm not used to success. This surprises me and blesses me, and I am profoundly grateful to the Lord for how he has used this book. I still cannot believe how many different kinds of people have read it and the feedback that I've gotten. I of course, as I mentioned, the National Prayer Breakfast, I got a handwritten letter from George W. Bush who'd read the book. And I am not somebody who comes from a family where we have letters from presidents or ex-presidents. I was stunned at the honor that a president had read my book, and I got to visit with him in Dallas. And I did mention it at the National Prayer Breakfast when I had the privilege again through this book of speaking to a sitting president, Obama, and to give him the book and to say that George Bush had read the book, no pressure. So So let me actually encourage you, if I would, to go to my website. It is free for the next 10 days, ericmetaxas.com, because the video, it's an amazing thing. I don't have time to recount it, but I promise you, it was a profound honor to be speaking to so many people, so many important people, and to see what God can do. A lot to go into there, which I won't tonight. But to speak at the National Prayer Breakfast is certainly the honor of my life. So God has done many things with this book and through this book, and the question, of course, is why? And I think it's because this is a story, a life, given as a gift to us. The Lord gave us the life of Bonhoeffer as a gift, because there are many corollaries today. I did not know when I went into writing the book that there were. I went into it, as I say, ignorantly. But I discovered in researching this period and in researching his life that there were staggering parallels to what we are living through in some ways now. Now, you can push that too far, and people would leap right to the end and say, oh, obviously, so Obama's Hitler, right? No. If you leap there, you haven't read carefully and you're kind of stupid. So we're not saying that. But what we are saying is that there are nonetheless powerful and disturbing and serious parallels to what happens when a state has too much power and tries to gain more power and tries to shove the church into a small little room where it won't bother anybody in public life or in that culture. So tremendous parallels. I think that's part of the reason, maybe the reason, that the book has resonated so widely and so much. Anyway, enough said on that. I want to tell you then briefly as I can, the story of Bonhoeffer, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So Bonhoeffer, in a nutshell, was born in 1906 into what must fairly be described as an absolutely spectacular family. If you've read the book, you know the family is clearly the place where he learns how to be Bonhoeffer. There's some great men that arise out of a vacuum, not Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He comes out of a truly great family. His father was the most famous psychiatrist in Germany for the first half of the 20th century, a very famous doctor and scientist. Bonhoeffer's mother was a genius, and all the brothers and sisters, there were 4 boys and 4 girls, all geniuses, all married geniuses. His brother, called Friedrich, goes into physics, and for a Bonhoeffer, going into physics means you will split the atom with Max Planck and Albert Einstein. That's exactly what he did. I've seen the atom in a museum in Dresden. It's about the size of a softball. Yeah, they were much larger in those days. You probably didn't. Very easy to split, but he split it with an axe. Nonetheless, he was one of the first to do it. But thank you for knowing that's a lie. But he did split the atom with Max Planck and Albert Einstein. That's the kind of family this was. Bonhoeffer's other brother became the legal head of Lufthansa. His sisters were geniuses. They married geniuses. On and on it goes. So he grows up in this family, and at age 14, he shocks the family by announcing to them that he wants to be a theologian. They weren't so happy about this, most of them. The mother's father and the mother's grandfather were theologians. The grandfather was quite a famous theologian, but the father, as a scientist, wasn't so keen on this. He was more of an agnostic, but he had trained his kids rather strictly to think clearly, to think like a scientist, to follow the facts and the evidence and the logic where it leads, so that you know what you believe, that you don't think with your emotions, you don't express yourself in cliches, you think clearly, you express yourself clearly. At the Bonhoeffer dining room table, if you didn't have something to say, you would absolutely shut up, because this was a very difficult place. I don't think that they were cruel, really, but it was the sort of place with all these smart older brothers and sisters around the table. You would think twice and 3 times and 10 times before you opened your mouth. But this was something that, it was the crucible in which Bonhoeffer was formed, so that he had an extraordinarily fine mind to begin with, but it was trained to think clearly. Now, the family not only put a premium on thinking clearly and on expressing oneself clearly, but also on living out what one said one believed. In other words, you could not say something and not live it. If you didn't live it, you were a hypocrite, right? A liar, phony. You have to actually live out what you say you believe. They put a premium on this, and I think this is very important for Bonhoeffer as he grows up. His mother always made that clear, that both parents, I should say, expected the children to behave a certain way, to live out what they claimed to believe. Very, very important going ahead. So he decides at age 14 he's going to be a theologian. He decided it, I should say, at age 13, but he kept his mouth shut for a year because, the Bonhoeffer house, you wouldn't just cavalierly announce things like this, because if you said at age 13 you want to be a theologian, they would hold you to it for at least one lifetime. So you'd be very careful about declaring anything foolishly. But he announces it at 14. He knew that he was going to be a great academic theologian. He knew that, and he was that. He was in fact, a theological genius. He gets his doctorate in theology from Berlin University at age 21. Anybody impressed by that? That's almost as impressive as my having written for VeggieTales. You'd have to agree, right? Almost. So Bonhoeffer gets a doctorate at age 21. Anybody get their doctorate at age 21? I'm always curious if somebody's going to raise their hand. I hope. No? Me either. Although I can tell Father Sirico that just a week ago, I announced publicly that I have begun work in earnest on my honorary doctorate. And I'm sure I'm going to apply myself, that's going to happen. So, or I could just borrow one from George Weigel, maybe. He's got 12, I think. But I have to say that, Bonhoeffer really was something in the academic field. You have to understand, Berlin University was the place on the planet to study theology at that time. And so he gets his doctorate, and the question he's asking and answering in his 2 dissertations is, what is the church? He had an epiphany in Rome at St. Peter's, where he saw arrayed on the altar celebrating Mass on Palm Sunday men of all different races, and this moved him to think about the church beyond Germany, the church beyond the Lutheran church. He was always thinking of this, and so he wrote his dissertation on this question, what is the church? But he finds in answering the question on this very high theological level, what is the church, that he has a love for the church itself and decides that not only does he want to be an academic theologian, he also wants to be ordained as a Lutheran minister. But you had to be 25 at that time to be ordained. And so at age 22, he spends a year in Barcelona, Spain as an assistant vicar and a German-speaking congregation. He picks up Spanish in a weekend, I think. If you have that kind of a mind, don't tell me because I hate you. And he then, at age 24, decides to go to America. Now, his brother Carl Friedrich, the physicist, had been to America, and he decides, I'd like to spend a year in America. They were very culturally curious, the Bonhoeffers. We have to understand that they had read everything. They were familiar with every symphony, every painting. They had traveled widely. They were extraordinary human beings, and I would think the finest flower of German culture. I was really moved to see what this family was like. But he decides at age 24 to go to New York to have this experience of living in New York. And I don't get the impression that he was going there for theological reasons. The ostensible reason you always read about is that he studied at Union Theological Seminary for that year. But he wasn't expecting to find much by way of theology at Union Theological Seminary, and it's safe to say he was not disappointed. He really writes in his letters, it's funny, I quote the letters copiously because it's so funny to write what he writes. He's very generous, very gracious, but nonetheless clearly sneering at what, in what his phrase, passes for theology, because he found it to be very shallow theology. He was not theologically liberal, but he was impressed by the theological liberals at Berlin University. They were fine minds, and he could learn from them, even though ultimately he ends up disagreeing with them. He could learn from them, learn to speak their language. Now he comes to New York, and the theological liberalism that he encounters is quite shallow as far as he's concerned. He says it's just, knee-jerk anti-fundamentalism. If whatever the fundamentalists are for, they're against it. So it really is a warmed-over social gospel. Of course, we don't have that in any seminaries today, but in those days, they did. And so he really is not impressed by it at all, but it's safe to say that the reason he was there had little to do with theological studies. As I said, he got his doctorate several years before from the finest institution on the planet. He was there, I think, really to experience New York and America. And so one Sunday in September of 1930, when he arrives, one of his fellow students, an African-American student from Alabama named Frank Fisher, invites Bonhoeffer to go up to Harlem to visit Abyssinian Baptist Church. Bonhoeffer is thrilled to be invited, and he goes, again, culturally curious. He goes, and what he experiences in this African-American church in September of 1930, to cut to the chase, changes his life forever. He is profoundly moved by seeing a congregation, a huge congregation, by the way, of people who are not strangers to suffering. These people somehow take what they're doing here in this church seriously. They're worshiping God. It's palpable. The music, the worship is not just music, but it's clearly worship. They're worshiping Jesus Christ with everything they have. Bonhoeffer was impressed by the preaching, fiery gospel preaching that exhorted people to live out the gospel in their lives. So it was everything together. Bonhoeffer had not really seen much of this, if any of this kind of vibrant, full-throated Christian faith. He'd experienced a lot of, I would say, fussy Lutheranism. We've all been to churches where they do church very well. I didn't mention Grand Rapids, but I'm just saying, I think you probably have that here as much as we have it in New York City. There are plenty of those kinds of churches. Bonhoeffer had seen a lot of that. He had not seen anything like what he saw at Abyssinian Baptist Church. So it touched him so profoundly that he makes a decision to go back to this church every Sunday that he's in New York. And I just imagine the idea of this tow-headed, bespectacled Berlin academic going up to Harlem every Sunday to worship in this extraordinary church. But it really did change him. He got involved in the lives of the congregation. He ended up teaching Sunday school there, and he traveled with a number of these prominent African Americans down to Howard University. And I know Thurgood Marshall would have been a student at Howard at the time. And he traveled to the nation's capital and was very involved in the idea of this nascent civil rights movement. So he goes back to Germany, and his friends notice he's somehow different. He seems to take Christianity somehow more seriously. Now, of course, he had this extraordinarily fine academic mind beforehand. You can read in my book what he writes before this period, and he gets the gospel spectacularly well. But somehow his heart was touched in this experience of this African-American church. Somehow he had seen true faith in a way that was new to him, and over the course of those months it changes him. And his friends can see this, that he is in fact different. When he's teaching from behind the lectern at Berlin University, or when he's preaching from the pulpit, he's saying things that you wouldn't ordinarily hear. For example, from behind the lectern, he's talking about the Bible as the Word of God, through which a living God wishes to speak to his children. An amazing thing to hear in Berlin at Berlin University during this period. You wouldn't. But he was brilliant enough he could sort of get away with it. He asked one of his students at one time, "Do you love Jesus?" It was clear that Bonhoeffer had had an experience with God somehow, and he was communicating this to his students. Now, we have to say that Germany during this period had also changed. When Bonhoeffer left for New York, the Nazis were the 9th largest political party in the Reichstag. When he returns, they're the 2nd largest political party in the Reichstag. And Bonhoeffer can see this. He can smell this. He can sense, I think, on some prophetic level, sense that Germany is turning toward Nazism, and we can understand why. If we're fair-minded, we can understand that probably we would have done the same thing. The Nazis were not exactly advertising themselves as evil incarnate. Political figures don't do that, right? And so you've got somebody who was extremely canny politician, was not about to tell the German people that he despised Christianity as a weak faith, which is exactly what Hitler said and what his top lieutenants believed, but pretend to be a churchgoer and so on and so forth. But Bonhoeffer can see through this, and he sees Germany turning toward National Socialism, and he begins now to speak out against it publicly. He says, for example, in Germany, Christians can only have one Savior, and that is Jesus Christ. Very pointed thing to say when most Germans are looking with a messianic fervor to Hitler. In 1933, of course, Hitler becomes chancellor. 2 days later, Bonhoeffer goes on the radio and gives a famous speech in which he dissects the bad idea, extremely popular idea, of the Führer principle. Führer, of course, is German for leader, and there was this idea in Germany, between the wars especially, that what we need is strong leadership. They'd had that under the Kaiser. They lost it at the end of World War I when the Kaiser abdicated, and most Germans thought, we need that again. We had that once, and we were great. We lost that. Now we're crushed. We're miserable. We're rudderless. We have the Weimar Republic. We have this kind of democracy that we don't know what to think of it. We've never had it before. It's not working for us, and we'd like a strong leader. Well, we know they got a strong leader. If you'd ask them, what kind of leader are you looking for? They would say, a leader who leads. That's what they were looking for. They got one of those. They weren't really terribly specific about it. And of course, Hitler comes right into this vacuum. And Bonhoeffer, again, he sees this. And on the radio 2 days after Hitler becomes the Führer, Bonhoeffer dissects this idea for the nation on the radio. And he talks about God's idea of leadership, the idea that true leadership, true authority, is by definition submitted to a higher authority. And we know that Hitler was submitted to no one. The German idea of leader, the Führer, was, it was a tautology. It's a snake swallowing its own tail. He's submitted to no one. Where does he get his leadership from? From no one. Somehow it's just his, and he takes it. It almost has a demonic aspect to it. Bonhoeffer sees this. He dissects this idea on the radio. He also says that a true leader must be a servant leader. That's what a leader does. A leader doesn't lord it over his subjects. Well, Bonhoeffer says this, and from the beginning, 2 days after Hitler's rise to power, Bonhoeffer's on the record as seeing what's going on and speaking out publicly against this. The first way Bonhoeffer gets involved really in what is happening is in what's called the Kirchenkampf, the church struggle. As some of you know, the Nazis, being good totalitarians, weren't just taking over every part of society. They were also taking over the church because they thought it's a legitimate part of society for us to take over, to reshape in our own monstrous image. And so they were trying to do that and trying to change Christianity from the inside. In other words, not to abolish it. Of course, they want to abolish it, but they wouldn't do that publicly. They'd rather just sort of hollow it out and, fill it with their own ideology. And that's exactly what they were doing. And Bonhoeffer was one of the leading figures who saw this happening and saw that Christians must stand up and fight this together. He was one of the leaders in what came to be known as the Confessing Church. In 1934, they wrote the Barmen Declaration. I quote that And they make a break. About 6,000 pastors signed the Barmen Declaration a year after the Nazis came to power, and these 6,000 pastors break away from the Nazified Reichskirche, the state church. A very brave thing, and in some ways a victory, but Bonhoeffer could see that the Nazis are gaining more and more power, and that this victory of this political victory of the separation and forming the confessing church ultimately won't mean so much, because the Nazis kept getting power. They knew how to use the laws to make it tougher and tougher for the church to be the church. And that, of course, is something that we see today. We don't have time to go into it now, maybe in the Q&A, but it's an extraordinary thing, how using legality you can sort of outmaneuver people. The Nazis were masterful at this, at dividing this one from that one. And I have to say that Bonhoeffer somehow was able to see with his fine mind and his finely trained mind, and with, I think, on some level, a mystical, prophetic sense, able to see way past what others were seeing at where this was going. Even into the mid-30s, you have many solid Christians who seem to think that the Nazis are okay. Maybe they're not perfect, but we can work with them. They won't be here forever. Bonhoeffer was never fooled, and he was frustrated in trying to wake the church up, in trying to get the church to be the church, to see what is happening, to fight against it now, because it'll be too late, which is, of course, exactly what happened. He was praying diligently, always asking the Lord to lead him, to show him what to do next. He didn't have it all figured out. He sensed that this is a deeper battle. We're going to be fighting on a higher plane. It's not just this church struggle. There's something more here. In 1935, the confessing church leaders deputized Bonhoeffer to lead an illegal seminary because, of course, the German Reichskirche, they were not raising up men of God, and the confessing church realized we need real seminaries where our young men will be trained properly. And so Bonhoeffer led one of those, first at Zingst and then Finkenwalde. And this I think of as the golden era of Bonhoeffer, where he's able to put into practice some of the things that he'd been writing about and thinking about and doing on weekend retreats and so on and so forth. He was training these young men not just what it means to be a cleric, not just how to exegete Scripture, not just how to run a Lutheran service, but in fact, how to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Out of this, we get his book, Life Together, and also, of course, The Cost of Discipleship. This idea that we're called to be obedient disciples of Jesus Christ. We're called to know him personally, and we're called to take orders from him, to know how to do that on some mature level, to be a mature Christian who knows how to walk with God and hear from God, whatever that means. Bonhoeffer was teaching this to these young men. Some of the more hidebound Lutherans were troubled by this. Karl Barth himself actually was troubled by this. It's funny to read the letters between them. I quote those in the book. In fact, I was recently in Switzerland. The book's been published now in German, and I had the privilege of speaking in Switzerland and Germany recently. Actually, not so recently, in January, and I went to the Karl Barth house and had the privilege of seeing the actual letters and touching the letters between Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth. So Bonhoeffer continues to do this. Of course, the Gestapo finally shuts down Finkenwalde. They know what's going on, so it's shut down. But Bonhoeffer, being the canny man that he was, sort of takes this education underground. It becomes, I always think, like a floating craps game. The Nazis don't know where it's happening, in a vicarage here, in a farmyard there, in a farmhouse there. It's just very funny to me but Bonhoeffer had no problem with fooling the Nazis, with deceiving the evil Nazis. And so this theological training continues for some time. But around 1938, the Gestapo shuts that down. They forbid Bonhoeffer from doing this, and they also forbid him from speaking publicly, and then finally from publishing, because he had the temerity to write a book on the Psalms, which some of you may know are located in the Old Testament. Did you know that? Yeah. In New York, some people don't know that. But the reason I say that is because the Nazified church in Germany was trying to redefine Christianity, as I said, along Nazi lines, which means that German Christianity was supposed to be purely German and therefore devoid of all Jewish elements. good luck with that project. I don't know what they were thinking, but I write about this in a chapter in the book. Some of it's quite funny and so sick and tragic at the same time that they actually seem to think that we can dispense with the Old Testament because it's too Jewish. But we'll invent our own Aryan Christianity. Now, again, there's nothing new under the sun. There are people trying to do things like this today. I won't mention specific denominations, but the reality is that it happens. This is what people do. And so Bonhoeffer has the temerity, or maybe the chutzpah, to write a book on the Old Testament Psalms, and is for this forbidden from publishing further. And he's continually praying and asking the Lord, what do I do now? What do I do now? Lord, lead me. How can I serve you in the Third Reich? Of course, now the war is coming, and he would be forced to participate in the war. He would not fight in the war, not because he's a pacifist in the way that we think. Bonhoeffer has sometimes been misportrayed as kind of a standard issue Vietnam-era pacifist. I think, he's been presented as somebody who, had he lived, would have been the third guy in bed with John and Yoko, which is really not the case. And you just dated yourself by laughing at that. And the reality is, but the reality is that he was a pacifist the way any Christian is a pacifist, where you say, I will not fight in a war of aggression. And he could see that Hitler was leading Germany to a hyper-nationalistic war of aggression, and there was no way he would allow himself to participate in this. He didn't speak out strongly against it. He didn't tell his seminarians they couldn't do that. They couldn't defend the fatherland in their eyes if they thought that's what they were doing. So he's not the pacifist he's been portrayed as, in my estimation. Nonetheless, he knew he could not fight in Hitler's war, so what's he going to do now? The war is coming. Where does he go? He can't say, I want to be a conscientious objector. So basically what happens is he decides to effectively escape to New York, to go back to New York. He has friends pull strings. It was not easy. Reinhold Niebuhr gets involved, and Bonhoeffer is able to go to New York before the war starts, with the idea that he will stay there and kind of ride things out safely in America. But no sooner does he get off the ship in June of 1939 than he has a keen sense that he has missed God. He does not have the peace of God. He's praying assiduously. You can read in the book, there's a whole chapter where I'm quoting his letters and his journals from this time, and you can see him wrestling with the Lord and saying, Lord, lead me. You must lead me. There's no magic scripture that tells me the answer. You've got to show me in the scriptures. What do you have for me? He knew that he had to hear from God, and he does, and he feels keenly that he must go back. Now, when you think about this, it's an extraordinary thing to go back to Nazi Germany as Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the summer of 1939. But he felt the Lord was calling him to this, and so he went, obedient disciple of Jesus Christ that he was. Now, the question is, what was he going to do when he got there? And this is where the story, of course, gets exceedingly strange. His brother-in-law, Donanyi, was a leading member of German military intelligence, the Abwehr. The Abwehr was the center of the conspiracy against Adolf Hitler. That was not widely known. That's how we know it's a conspiracy. Thank you. And so Bonhoeffer is hired by his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law says, how would you like to come to work for me in the Abwehr? That way you'll look like you're serving the Third Reich in time of war. We can use your great brain and your contacts throughout Europe to work for the German military intelligence, but we know, and the family knows, what you'll really be doing. You'll be working for me in the conspiracy to defeat Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. And what he was supposed to do, of course, was travel around Europe to neutral countries, which you certainly could not do unless you're a special member of military intelligence, but he could travel to Sweden and to Switzerland, travel to these countries in the hopes of making contact with members of the Allied governments. Imagine talking to the enemy during a time of war. This is exactly what he set out to do. He continued writing and being a pastor during this time in some ways, but this was his job. So he continued along these lines. That's a story in and of itself. In 1942, he got engaged. That love story has really never been told before. In setting out to write this book, I had no idea that I would write anything really new. I simply wanted to retell the story as I did with the Wilberforce book, just retell the story in a new way for a new generation, give it some context and so on and so forth. But there are a number of things that end up being quite new. One of them, the most dramatic maybe, is the story of this love affair, which hasn't really been properly told before. The love letters between Bonhoeffer and his fiancée Maria von Wedermeyer weren't published till 1992. So, and a lot of the people who wrote about Bonhoeffer, Eberhard Bethge most famously, really didn't feel comfortable maybe writing about this because he knew all the players and he didn't want to reveal the stories. Of course, I have no compunction about that. So I wrote the story, and I've had the privilege of meeting two of Bonhoeffer's fiancées' sisters, spending time with them, extraordinary privilege. But I write the story of this amazing love affair in the book. It's a beautiful story. Bonhoeffer gets engaged, but no sooner does he get engaged than finally the Gestapo catches up with him and arrests him. Not for his involvement in the plot to kill Hitler, because they hadn't yet discovered that, but for his involvement in something called Unternehmen 7, Operation 7, so-called because it was a plot to get 7 German Jews out of Germany and into Switzerland to save their lives. There were some financial irregularities and things that went on. The Gestapo picked up on it, and some names came up. Bonhoeffer was arrested and taken to Tegel military prison, but he had every hope of getting out. He is writing these wonderful letters, which I quote to his fiancée and to his family. He's expecting to get married. He's thinking that he's going to be able to fool the prosecutor and convince the prosecutor that he's just a woolly-headed academic. By the way, no offense to any woolly-headed academics who are here. I apologize. But this was his idea, that he was going to say, no, I was just helping my brother-in-law. But of course, didn't turn out that way. I should say that he hoped that he could win the case, that things would come to trial soon, that he would win. Or he thought the Allies will defeat Germany and this nightmare will be over and I'll get out of prison that way. Or the conspirators, who haven't yet been discovered, will succeed in killing Hitler and things will end that way. So he had every hope of getting out, but we know that he was still in Tegel military prison in the summer of '44 when the Valkyrie Plot happens. I write about all these different plots to kill Hitler. Fascinating stories. I said I've got to put these in the book because they're so amazing. And the last one, of course, is the Valkyrie Plot, where the briefcase is put under the table and the vector of the blast is divided. Hitler survives, but not only does Hitler survive, but for the first time the conspiracy is exposed. So in July of '44, this huge conspiracy is exposed. Thousands are arrested, tortured. Names come up. One of those names, of course, top of the list is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So he is now transferred to the dreaded Gestapo prison on Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, and then as the Allies are bombing Berlin, he's moved from there to Buchenwald, and in April of '45, so close to the end of the war, weeks from the end of the war, weeks from the suicide of Adolf Hitler, on the express orders of Hitler, Bonhoeffer is transferred to Flossenburg concentration camp, where at dawn on April 9th, he is executed. So we're tempted to think of this story, I think, initially as merely tragic, but I have to say that Bonhoeffer would be the first in line to rebuke us in the same way that Jesus rebukes Peter when Peter says, "Oh no, Lord, you can't die that way. You can't." He says, "Get thee behind me, Satan, because you're not thinking the thoughts of God, but the thoughts of man." I think it's clear that Bonhoeffer was such a devoted disciple of Jesus Christ that he was resigned to the will of God with the peace that comes from being resigned to the will of God. Resigned is really not the right word. That he rejoiced in the will of God for whatever it was for his life. He wrote a sermon in 1933, 12 years before his death, where he talks about death. And in that, to I think a fairly staid Lutheran congregation, he says, death is the most terrible thing imaginable unless it is transformed by faith. And who knows but that your death can be the most wonderful thing imaginable. Actually, he says that if you have ever glimpsed the kingdom of heaven, truly, which is to say, if you are really a Christian, if you've ever really glimpsed God, which is necessary to be a Christian, if you've ever come to know him and ever seen him on any level, you are homesick from that hour. You long to be with him. You know that that is your true home. You're created for that. So Bonhoeffer plainly, clearly had no fear of death. He understood it for what it was. And as every Christian must know, he knew that Jesus had, in fact, defeated death. This is not just a metaphor we tell ourselves to feel a little bit better. This is absolutely true, and death was the last station on the road to freedom. Bonhoeffer knew this, and he believed it. I think in his generation, as in our generation, many people who would consider themselves Christians don't really believe it. Maybe they hope it, but they don't believe it. Bonhoeffer is saying, no. You must know this is true. You must absolutely believe this. You cannot live the life God has for you unless you know this. And here's the good news. It's true, so you can know it. And so Bonhoeffer went to the gallows with that peace. I think that he knew that your faith is worth nothing unless you believe it so much that it forces you to act, and you act with no fear. And you can tell who really believes. You can see it by how people live. We can't fool God by saying, well, my church has this statement of faith. God sees that as a fig leaf. He's not impressed. He knows your heart. He knows our hearts. He's looking at our lives. Our lives are our theology. We can say what we like. And Bonhoeffer, to me, is ultimately an example and an inspiration for us today to show us, what does it look like? What does it look like to live a profoundly Christian life, a faith-filled life in the midst of evil? What does that look like? It's a beautiful thing. So to me, this story is finally a great inspiration. Bonhoeffer lived this life. I just wrote about it. He lived this life, and living this life is not just a gift to God, but it's a gift to us. It's a gift that God gives us back, to look at this and to say, this is normative Christianity. This is not extra credit. We're all different, but God calls us to this level of faith, to this level of action based on what we say we believe. But if we really believe it, we will live it with no fear, knowing that we're answering to an audience of one. That's the only way to live. It's the only way to die. We need to, I think, know that, and I do think that it applies particularly for us now. Those of you who are in the room probably understand that. So we need to be inspired, and I really do believe that God offers us this story as an inspiration to us so that we will not make the mistakes that the German church made, so that we will heed God's call through the life of Bonhoeffer in the same way that in his generation it was not heeded. The prophets tend not to do so well in their own day, but later on we seem to see hear the wisdom of what they said, and understand that God was speaking through them. I think God was speaking through Bonhoeffer for us, for our sake. So we'll leave it at that. We've got a few minutes for Q&A. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for Q&A, and I think we have some roving microphones around. So, Eric, I'll turn it back to you, and we'll take a few minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. And if it can't be true or false, multiple choice, please. Yes, sir.
My name is Cooper O'Brien, and I go to Oglethorpe University. But my question is true or false? Did his family have any controversy with him being a part of the Nazi group but fighting against Hitler? Was there any family controversy in that?
Good question, and I ought to have made that clear in the talk, but that's as fast as I could talk. Actually, his family was practically at the center of the conspiracy against Adolf Hitler. It's an amazing thing. The whole family, from before the beginning of the Nazi rise, knew who the Nazis were and what they were, and were against them from the beginning. There's some natural explanations for that. They were in Berlin. They were very highly connected. I alluded to that, but I have to say they were very connected in high circles. So they knew everyone who was anyone, and they had all the secret information that your average German absolutely would have not been privy to. And they knew what was going on, and they were already in the 30s. I write about this in the book, that in 1933, they're already having secret conversations in their home, this huge home, and closing the door so that the help doesn't hear. In 1933, 2 months or 3 months after, in April of 33, after Hitler has become chancellor, they're having sort of secret meetings. So in some ways, their home and their network, their wider network, was a center of the conspiracy against Hitler, and they knew many of the players, and of course, Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, Donani, was one of the key players. So yes, they were at the center of it, and on the contrary, not only did they have no problem with it, but Bonhoeffer's brother Klaus was murdered by the Nazis for his role in the conspiracy. Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, two of his brother-in-laws were murdered by the Nazis. So they were at the very center of the conspiracy. I don't think that there was any Bonhoeffer that had any problems with this.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Teamy, and I work with Dr. Jennifer Roback-Morris at the Ruth Institute. We're from San Diego. You mentioned financial irregularities, and that's how he got caught. I was wondering if you could describe the nature of those irregularities and also the regulatory agency that discovered those irregularities.
Let me first say, what an odd question. Not a bad question, but I've never been asked that before, and I'm fascinated why you would ask that question, although I guess you guys are into economics. I don't know the exact nature. I can tell you this. What I surmised is that the delightfully neutral Swiss were demanding cash on the barrelhead for every Jew they accepted, which is horrifying. And somehow, in order to accept these Jews, they were demanding some kind of money, I guess, because they figured it would affect their economy. And so they, there was some financial transactions based around that, which were a little bit complicated. And the Gestapo was able to pick up on it. I think it was the Gestapo, so I don't think it was on any other agency. But what I know about it is in the book, and I don't know much about it. I've already told you more than I know, let me put it that way.
My name is Lois Olena. I'm on faculty at the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary. Thank you for every single one of those pages in the book. It was amazing. The last I read about whether or not Dietrich Bonhoeffer had been approved as a righteous Gentile in Israel, he had not been.
He's
and
not been.
I wondered
no.
if you could address that. What I read about was that because there's a certain criterion and a certain number of Jews or a certain way that Jews were saved, has any of that changed since the writing of the book?
I've been too busy to really be on this, but I have had a number of conversations. There's a man, Stephen Wise, who is the grandson of Stephen Wise, the rabbi about whom I write in the book. I was thrilled to get an email from somebody who said, this name seems familiar. Yes, it's the 80-something-year-old grandson of the famous Rabbi Stephen Wise, with whom Bonhoeffer corresponded. And he has been on this like crazy. He infuriated that Bonhoeffer is not listed in Yad Vashem, and he's been corresponding with them for years. And I mentioned it to Elie Wiesel, who knows the story of Bonhoeffer, and I met a woman whose family really funded Yad Vashem. But I haven't done much about it just because I'm so busy, and it's complicated. So I don't know what is going on. I think it's safe to say Bonhoeffer wouldn't care whether he's mentioned or not. We care, of course, and it would be the right thing for them to get him, to list him there. But that's about it.
I was wondering, my name's Timothy Krell.
You scared me, Timothy.
I'm sorry.
Don't sneak up on me like that.
I'm from a...
Wear bright colors. Go ahead.
I'm from a Protestant monastic order in New Jersey, and based
Aren't we all? Aren't we all? Most of us here are.
Based on his monastic communal life in Finkenwalde, I was
Yes.
wondering what role did Bonhoeffer see monastic community playing in the church, and in particular the Protestant church?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't really a monastic community, but yes, it was similar to that. I think that he really was enamored of the idea of Christian community and saw how important it was. And I think it is something that has been lost. You know, it was, there were a number of members of the, I mean, just to be clear, what it was is that Finkenwalde and Zingst, really Finkenwalde, it was a Christian community of all these brothers. It was more than just a seminary. It was a Christian community where they lived in community. And if you read the book Life Together, and by the way, my fondest hope is that people would read my book and it would lead them to read Bonhoeffer, The Cost of Discipleship and Life Together. Life Together is Bonhoeffer's explanation or explication of this communal living, and he talks about what it is to live among Christians. And some of it is, I mean, the most draconian thing I think that he says in there is that one of the rules that they had, and this does seem somewhat monastic, was that no one could speak about a brother in his absence. Try to live that. Do not talk about so-and-so in a well-meaning way, or in not such a well-meaning way, but that they really had, you know, it's not quite the rule of Benedict, but they had some real rules that they lived by. And it's clear that Bonhoeffer thought this was very important and that Christian community was important. Who's got the microphone?
Joshua Gideon with the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. First of all, thank you so much for your testimony of faith in Jesus. It was very much evidence and inspirational. I had a question regarding, you said that Bonhoeffer is, a prophet is not often accepted in his own time. So taking that and looking at our generation, and this is a great, I think, element here where we have so many different generations represented just in this room. What advice do you think Bonhoeffer would give to us, speaking specifically to the U.S. situation of...
Buy gold.
That's right.
Obviously, yes.
Thank you. What practical insight do you think you could give to us with our current situation that we're facing with religious liberties, with freedom, and just our situation right now?
Well, to the extent that I could make sense of what Bonhoeffer would say, it's exactly what I'm saying any chance I get. I mean, first of all, read and sign the Manhattan Declaration and be aware of what is happening. Thank you. It's horrifying to me to think that people, because of denominational reasons, will not sign the Manhattan Declaration. I won't mention who they are or what, but I am fascinated and horrified that people, I would say, worship an idol of theological purity more than they're worshiping Jesus Christ and more than they're being alive to what is happening in the culture. This is precisely how the German church failed to be the church of God in Germany. People say, how did that happen? It happened exactly the way it's happening now. Apart from the grace of God, it will happen again. That you must understand, you have to be able to read the times. You have to know when to fight. And you have to know when to merely pray for your leaders or when to take action. Bonhoeffer understood, as so few did, that was the time to take action, that it was possible to win if, en masse, the church would take action. They did not, and they lost. By the time they figured it out, it was too late. The window had closed. We are living that right now. It seems very clear to me. The HHS mandate is a clear example and a horrific example, because I would have liked to think that these things would happen, many years ahead. But to see this now happening, that there's a line in the sand where there's a principle at stake, and that we have to understand that has nothing to do with your view of contraception. Nothing. And that's nonsense when people say it's about contraception. It is not about contraception. It's the principle of religious freedom. When the government, with all of its power, can bully people, this is the end of America. This is at the very heart of who we are as a people, is that we protect minorities. We don't say, oh, it's only 12% black, so the whites can do what they like. No, we are America because we say the majority will use its power to protect the minority. That's what makes us different from any number of other governments, and it's the genius of this country, and it's what's made us great. So when we exceed on something like this, it's chilling to me that in my lifetime I can see something like this. We need to understand, every Protestant needs to know, and every American needs to know, that this is a threat to the United States of America. And if people think that that's silly, or they clearly don't understand what is at stake. This is an absolutely vital principle. It's served up to us on a silver platter. There it is, and we've got to fight. And this is exactly what happened with Bonhoeffer. The Catholics were over here, and he was saying that we must see what is happening, and together we can fight and we can win if we see the evil set against us. We need to do that today. There's certainly enough Christians. People say, how did that happen? You're a Christian nation. How many Christians are there in America? And what happened? Really? Amazing. Well, that is what's happening. Unless we fight, unless we publicly speak out against this and educate people so that they know. I mean, your average person in the pew, even in the Catholic Church, doesn't really get this. This is not, it's very difficult in this media to talk about it. Even on Fox News, this is not something that most of those folks get. So this is something that we need to be civil but loud and clear on that issue. And I would say the same thing on the same-sex marriage issue. Yeah.
I think we've got We've got time for one more question, I think way back over here.
Hello, my name is Amanda Blank, and I'm from Yale University,
I'm sorry.
which is where I learned about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So,
Well, then there's hope. Praise God.
the last person actually asked the question that I was going to ask, but I have a second question, and that is, was Bonhoeffer's father a believer, or was he agnostic?
Well, it seems that the Bonhoeffer family, it's a mixed bag. The father was an agnostic, but what is so beautiful, and the reason I write so much about the family, is that you see the respect and the love that the mother and father had for each other. They were a united front. They really understood the meaning of family and marriage in the way that they treated each other, and they presented a united front to the children. And so the father, while he was agnostic, he clearly respected the mother's deep faith and clearly participated in it. The family they would have Christian devotions and things, and he was a part of it, maybe with some distance, but he was very respectful of it. It's unclear where he ends up in terms of his faith. It's unclear where some of the brothers and sisters end up. Bonhoeffer was certainly, the most vibrantly Christian, but I think that the way Bonhoeffer treated the rest of his family who didn't share his faith exactly, his civility, his grace, his generosity in talking about it and the way he talked about it would be a model to all of us, especially loudmouth evangelicals like Eric Metaxas. We have to really be respectful of people who aren't where we are, knowing that but for the grace of God, we would be there. And knowing that God's ways are not our ways, and we can't hammer somebody and badger somebody and bully somebody into believing what we believe, that it's the Holy Spirit that must do that. Bonhoeffer really seemed to get that, and he didn't have this white-knuckled, I got to get this guy saved before the elevator hits the ground floor kind of attitude. Then you know what I'm talking about? So, but I really have to say it's a beautiful, his faith in that way, again, it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and it ought to instruct us a little bit about maybe a different way of looking at evangelism and different faith. Not that we ought not to be vigilant, but there's something about the way he approached it which I find important for us. So, thank you very much.